Hello and welcome to the Chalk Talk podcast. It takes a light-hearted look at all things education. We take things out of our school bag and share them with you to make your life in the classroom easier and also more enjoyable. My name's Ashley and I'm joined by my high school buddy and co-host, the newly TikTok famous Matt Miller.
How are you, mate? We're back.
We are, and how are you?
Very good, very good. Excited to be recording again for our new season of episodes.
Absolutely. It's been a little while between drinks. Have you been up to anything recently?
Lots. Back at school, you know how it is. Start of the term's always very, very busy.
Few new TikTok followers?
Yeah, it was a bit surprising, to be honest.
Go on, tell what's the story?
Yeah, one silly video of me at Officeworks, what it's like to be a teacher at Officeworks, and kind of blew up a little bit, and I thought if maybe 100 people saw it, that'd be pretty funny, but it ended up about 170,000 at last check, so I've had to put the account on private to hide from the kids and at school, and yeah, quite funny.
Could be internet security, could be an upcoming episode series that we're doing on...
Keeping yourself safe on social media.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we do have a slightly new format this time. We're going to get away from the whole check-in and what's your week been like and stuff like that. And we're going to try and keep it a little bit more research-based, looking at articles and reviewing different articles that have come up, either that have influenced us with what we're doing or... sort of new articles that are around that can help us with what we're doing.
And I guess having that research base, like for those in a lot of South Australian schools at the moment, the literacy and numeracy guidebooks seem to be a really big thing. So
absolutely,
we're going to have a bit of a look in there perhaps as well and see if there's anything there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think on that point, we're going to probably have like a South Australian type focus on it. I think as we've chatted in the last series, good teaching is good teaching wherever you are. The language that we use is going to be, TEFL and things like that. But the things that people take from this podcast will actually be able to help them regardless of where they're teaching. So basically, look, this article that we're going to be looking at this week is one that I think you actually introduced it to me. That was some of the reading we had to do as part of the numeracy coach, and it certainly stuck with me. So the article we're going to be looking at is Teaching Mathematics Using Research-Informed Strategies by Peter Sullivan, and this one's actually from 2011.
Yeah, and I came across this when I started out as a numeracy coach, so slightly before you did, and we'd been given the article to read before this PD, and particularly this chapter of it, and this bloke called Peter Sullivan was coming to talk to us, and I'd never really heard of him, but I guess this article and his PD has shaped the way I teach maths now, which is completely different to how I did starting out, and 6 principles in that he says based on research, and they're quite simple, but once you start to go a bit deeper into them, it comes back to what you said again.
Yeah,
it's just good teaching, and you could probably apply these to English, science.
Going back to what you said earlier, you talked about a lot of the schools using the literacy numeracy improvement guidebooks, and I think something else that's happening is with the new review cycle that's happening with education department schools, at least, is I've heard of a few schools that are getting the high impact teaching strategies as a focus moving forward.
Yeah.
And so I know they come out of some research done in Victoria, but I look at this, Peter Sullivan's articles 2011, and as we go through it today, you're going to be like, oh, well, that's this hit, that's that hit, and they actually... knowing, Peter's background, I think he is in Melbourne.
Monash University.
Like a lot of this work dovetails in with what he's doing, so which is quite interesting.
Yeah. Should we get into them? Let's do it.
Yeah, so basically, before we talk about the principles, I think just with the article, so what he does is he goes through some of the background on what education is, what maths education is, and he actually talks about the goals of school mathematics before he gets into the 6 principles for the effective teaching of maths. So the language they use is probably going to be similar. So, and Peter Sullivan was actually one of the authors of the Australian Curriculum Maths, wasn't he?
I think he was the chief writer for it. Or oversaw it.
Yeah. So it's probably going to be no surprise that the goals of school mathematics, according to this article, is conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, strategic competence, adaptive reasoning, and productive disposition.
Yeah, which you see right through the proficiencies and other parts of the Australian curriculum, maths from foundation to 10. So,
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the proficiencies, we're talking understanding, fluency, reasoning, problem solving, which is those four in a nutshell there. Interestingly enough, was the productive disposition was the fifth one. And I know that came from the National Council for Teachers of Maths in America. And it's interesting how the Australian curriculum went with four, whereas their research actually had that fifth one, which
yeah.
is quite an important one.
And you'll find that if you look at the National Council article about a similar one to this, they've got 8 principles that they talk
Yeah,
about,
okay.
and they are all pretty similar to these. And you put that with this one that we're going to talk about, and our numeracy team put together a South Australian, I guess, flair for
Yes, I
eight
remember that one.
effective practices that develop numeracy, and that was one that could stretch from preschool right through, and it's still floating around somewhere. I've seen it, so that's kind of good.
Yeah, we might be able to find that and dig it out. I actually have found that like a lot of that work, because for those that don't know my background, I've junior primary trained and now working in a secondary setting. That the saying "good teaching is good teaching" just keeps flowing perfectly
Yeah.
for me. So principle one then is articulating goals.
So yeah, and that's really, that one's just about identifying the key ideas that underpin sort of the concepts that you're going to teach, and how you communicate that to the kids, how the goals of that teaching are going to, get to an end point, and how you hope that they'll learn it. And it's very similar. It speaks the same thing as the learning intention success criteria stuff. That's what it is. Being intentional about your learning, communicating that to the kids, and communicating how they're going to learn that, and how that that they're going to be successful. Really simple. And you can do that in a variety of ways, whether it's verbal. Some people like to put it up on the board, a slideshow up on a slide, have it written up in the room so that you refer back to it.
I've started doing a bit of flip stuff with my year 8 maths, and I've kind of got a PowerPoint that they can work through in their own time. And just the first slide is it's literally, learning intentions. If you get to the end of this and you can do this, you're basically on the right track.
And when I did a little test with a class when I was doing my numeracy coaching, a teacher and I wanted to see the difference. We just played a game with the kids, and it was around fractions. And we said to the kids at the end of the lesson, and this was without articulating any goals, what'd you do? And they said, we just played a game for maths today.
Yeah.
Whereas the next day we articulated what the goals were for the learning, played the same game, asked the kids what did we do, and they were able to articulate we were aiming to add fractions together and convert the denominators to the lowest common denominator. So it's interesting just how that will, has that little shift and makes it a bit more purposeful for them.
Well, that's it. And I guess that probably leads into principle 2, which is making connections.
Yes, and a lot of that's about building on what they know already, both not just mathematically, but also throughout their experiences, and creating and connecting students with like stories that both contextualize the learning, but also establish a bit of a rationale. And it's an interesting one for maths, because maths is one of those ones where kids go, why do we have to learn this? And sometimes you go, oh, well, if you're going to do engineering at uni, or you're going to go on and do this, like sometimes there's not a clear connection that you can make for it. So,
well, you might become a teacher one day, and you're going to need to be able to teach someone else this stuff.
And you see all those things around, like I've gone through my life already and never had to use algebra once, which is technically not correct, but I guess algebra as people learned it, for example, probably you don't see it in everyday life unless you are an engineer, but or something like that. But it's also the work of Dan Meyer. He did 3-act maths, and I was lucky enough to go and see him when he came to Adelaide once, and he talked about how textbooks are horrible for this, that he shared an example with us about, I think it was about calculating speed, kilometers, well, it was miles per hour because it was an American one. And the context that they put there was calculating the speed of an elephant versus a rhinoceros or something like that. And like he said, he put that to a class, and the kids were basically saying, why do we care about the speed of an elephant, like how fast it runs? Whereas seeing if you can be creative with ways, like get them outside running and sprinting, or doing something, like trying to contextualize it a bit better, because why the hell would they care about how fast an elephant can run.
I love the example that Peter uses in the article. Always, it's so, the example is changing the question from a farmyard has pigs and chickens. There are 10 heads and 26 legs. How many pigs and chickens might there be? And then, the reformulation of the problem is a ute has some people and some dogs in the back. There are 10 heads and 26 legs. How many people and how many dogs?
And for some kids in the city who live in the city, they may not have seen that sort of stuff. So it's about contextualizing it for your local area as well, if you can. But
absolutely,
I think you got to be careful about trying to, as Dan Meyer said, shoehorn maths concepts into a context that have no place belonging there. Like,
yeah,
making that sort of stretching to make that connection.
Yeah, well, exactly. And so principle 3 is fostering engagement.
Yes. One of my favourite ones, I think this is probably the one that I always aim to be doing, particularly when I'm teaching maths. I think it's my favourite one, if I can say that. And that's just about engaging kids by using a variety of challenging tasks. And I think the big one here that Peter says is that allows students time. And that's a big one, giving them time to work on some challenging tasks.
Absolutely.
Opportunities there to make decisions and use a variety of forms of representations. I think they're really key. Giving them time, opportunities to make some decisions for themselves about how they're going to do the task, and then using a variety of forms of representation, whether they can show their thinking with a diagram or whether it's with a written way, or asking the kids to do it in two different ways. But the rich and challenging task is another big one there. And one big one in my toolkit, and I'm sure you use it as well, is the open-ended task. I find that can be quite a good way of doing it.
Yeah, exactly. We've been using the Joe Bowler's Week of Inspirational Maths the last couple of years now at our school. That was something we brought in just to, instead of jumping straight into content, getting kids engaged. I know one of the things that they really focus on is telling kids that the quick thinking isn't always the right thinking, and maths takes time, and if you don't get it straight away, it's okay, and you're allowed to get into it.
And that quick thinking is a big mindset thing for kids, because what I did find when I was numeracy coaching, I'd go into classes and there would be your quote unquote high flyers. They were really good at the quick thinking and the fluency, and everyone told them they were smart. But then when we were starting to do some of these challenging tasks that took some thinking and didn't rely on the quick answer, some of the kids that they saw as not so good at maths were actually shining. And I've found in some cases those kids that were quote unquote smart at maths really struggled with it and slightly disengaged in some ways as well. So
I always remember back to the one scenario that I had where the school I was at, they were still doing streaming, and they'd use this test. Just wait. They'd use this test and they'd say, all right, well, we've got 3 teachers. You're here, you're here, you're here. And that was it for the rest of the year. And all their maths was based on that. And I knew from the data that we had that a couple of these Indigenous kids, their spatial sense and geometric reasoning was like the top of the class. And because they got a bad score in number, they kept on getting put in that bottom group. And all of a sudden they'd do some stuff on space and there'd be behavior problems because they were just bored out of their brains. That actually leads us into like the principle 4, which is differentiating challenges.
Yeah, and I guess this will be a bit of a segue into that. When you're saying about streaming, I have heard some people like Peter say streaming can work under a couple of provisos. Streaming does actually work for your higher end kids because they're always given more harder stuff to keep them challenged, so they benefit from them the most. And if you're going to have the low class, you need to put your most skilled teacher with the lower group. Now, often what happens with streaming is the most skilled maths teacher will always work with the high-flying group, which is a bit backwards, and it very rarely happens. And I could go on about streaming for a long, long time, and I'm not. But differentiating challenges, that's a big one. Whenever I've done challenging tasks with classes, people say, oh, you'd only give that to the high flyers, wouldn't you? And I said, no, I give it to all of them, and I just adjust up and down. So interacting with the kids while they engage in the experiences and interacting with each other, asking and answering questions as you go, and plan to specifically plan to support those kids who need support and those that need challenge. And I always used to do that with my open-ended tasks. I'd have what's called an enabling prompt and a extending prompt. And the enabling prompt would just be pretty much the same question as the original one posed, but it might just modify the numbers a bit easier or slightly less demand. Yeah. And what I'd often find with that is the kids that did struggle with the original task, you give them something a little bit easier, slightly easier numbers, one less step to have to do. Then they would go, okay, I get it now. And then they could have a go at the other task. And then the extending prompt might make the numbers a bit more complex, add another layer to the task. There might be another step or do a conversion to decimal now and blah, blah, blah. But I think a key thing with that is like when I would share that with some people, they'd go, okay, well, Ashley, Matt and Billy, they can do the extending one, and then but can do the they'll only get to do the easy one, and that's, you're going back to streaming there. And often I would find some kids that were strugglers, they'd start at the middle, struggled, so go and do the enabling, get back to the original task, and even have a go at the extension. So I think it's important not to just pigeonhole kids as these kids will do that, these will do that, these will do that.
And if we go back to the giving them time to actually go back and say, oh, actually, yeah, I understand that, and go through. And that's where some of the work we did with Tina Kennedy, she marks the problem-solving questions with different coloured pens, and that talks about how much support they've been given. And so giving them time to stop and do thinking. And we found that we'd come around with a pen, and the kids go, no, just let me think about this for a minute.
Shout out to Tierney as well. Maths chick, legend.
We've got some of the archives from our previous Chalk Talk podcast, and we're going to intersperse, I think, some of our literature reviews with re-releasing some of those interviews we've done with some of our favourites.
Yeah.
We said we're going to keep this to 20 minutes, and we're already there. So principle 5 is structuring lessons.
Yeah, so it's not just about how you've got like a warm-up, a main part of the lesson, and a review or something at the end. This one also delves a little bit into what sort of practices you're structuring into your lessons. So whether it's structured that you'll have some group work or some paired work or some individual work, that's also a key part of this. But also structuring in time at the end. And a lot of people will say having the review at the end is the most key part of your lesson. Like people like Anne Baker have said it, Peter Sullivan, they all say it.
Yeah.
But having kids reporting back to the class as well about their learning. And I think we don't generally do that well. And Peter talks about in here, he went over to Japan to observe their lessons, and they do a thing called lesson study, Japanese lesson study. You can Google it. There's some really cool, interesting things about there, and it's their version of performance development. But they have 4 key elements of a less mathematics lesson in Japan. The first 2, so I guess basically 2 things that we do well are introduce lessons and kids working on the problem. But then what we generally don't do well is a whole class discussion at the end and the teacher summarizing the key ideas. So I think a lot of it's about making time for that reflection at the end as part of your structure. I also like to have a warm-up at the start, and sometimes the warm-up will relate to it, the lesson. Sometimes it might just be some quick number work. I really love Number Talks by Joe Bowler. I could do a whole episode on that. But getting away from things like mental maths, that's just not good. So if you're doing that, stop doing that.
In a secondary setting, a warm-up's good. I like to have something up on the board that when the kids first come in, they see it and they do it, or like a hands-on activity they can grab. And part of the reason of doing that is if kids are coming from different elective subjects, they'll be there at different times. And so they can come in and not have to sit and waste the first few minutes of the lesson waiting for everyone else to get there.
Yeah, I like that.
All right, so principle 6 is promoting fluency and transfer.
And Peter talks about he put this one in. Originally, he had this one left off, so he actually had it at 5. But he put this one in because this is one that most people can relate to, is fluency within maths. And that looks a lot of different ways. And people might just look at it, the fluency side of things, as doing 20 questions, repeating the same skill 20 times. It's important to be able to repeat that skill sometimes, and do it in short bursts, he says.
Yeah.
But the big thing I think about the fluency is, and it comes into the proficiencies in the Australian curriculum, Tierney talks about it, everyone talks about it, is you actually need to build that fluency first
Yeah.
from conceptual understanding. So rather than going into the rote stuff and just repeating a process or a skill, really big learning for me was in my first 2 years of teaching when I taught year sevens when I was up in Wyala. I think it was a measurement topic, and it was area of a triangle was one of the things that we got up to. And I was all keen, and I was like, right, I'm going to give them all these questions. I'm just going to tell them the formula. So I told them the formula is half base times height. So here's how you do one, off you go and do it. And I want you to, do these 20 triangles and work them out. And kids weren't really getting into it. And I said, what's going on? And the kids said, well, why is it half base times height for a triangle? And I was like, it's a good question. I wasn't sure. And I sort of had one of those moments where I was like, geez, I actually didn't know. But as a mathematician at school, I could do that process automatically, but I just didn't have the conceptual understanding to be able to do that. And that affected how I was able to reason and how these kids were able to reason. So I went away and came up with a bit of a task where we cut out rectangles, turned them into triangles, and they had to prove. And I thought at first for year sevens, that's going to be a bit babyish, but it actually, you see all the light bulbs going on, and the
Yeah.
magic thing I love to hear from kids in maths is, oh, and then bang, they were able to get it, and their reasoning around some much harder problems that I started giving them was a lot better because they knew it was half of the rectangle,
Yeah.
across the diagonals.
Here's some more about me as a person. I was getting some stuff ready for class and whatnot. And I'm like, you're a maths teacher when you have a favorite proof for a formula, because I love the proof for the formula of a trapezium, because you basically get the trapezium, flip it up and rotate it, and then put two together, and it turns it into a parallelogram. And then the parallelogram is base times perpendicular height, and then because you've got two of them, it's actually half base times perpendicular height for the area of the trapezium. I just love, like, visually, like, that's just such a fantastic proof.
I think the key thing is it's about understanding where it comes from and why it is the way it is, and that can be for anything. Like when you're
Yeah.
teaching multiplication facts, not times tables, multiplication facts, I often start, and it's a big ideas in number thing with kids. With my year fours, they really struggled, but we started with arrays, 3 rows of 6, 3 rows of 5, which is the same as 5 rows of 3. And they were able to pick up their multiplication facts and make them stick a
Yep.
lot better because they had that conceptual understanding of what it was. And I didn't teach them any tricks with their multiplication facts, like the nines where you put a finger down and do all this fancy stuff. They didn't need that because they had a conceptual understanding about what was behind it and arrays and things like that. So
Yeah, and that's funny you should say that, because I saw Tierney's just posted something not that long ago about, can we please stop calling them magic tricks for maths? It's no trick about it. There's no secret. We all have the knowledge.
I know, and I part of what I just said came from seeing that post actually. So there you go.
We did a fantastic webinar with Neil deGrasse Tyson with my year eights, and one of the key take homes from that for me was, if I give you knowledge, that knowledge becomes yours. I don't want you to go away and reference me when you're sharing with that someone else. That knowledge is now yours to give to someone.
Exactly.
And I love that.
Love it. That's a good one.
Well, that's probably a good place to stop as well. We've got through the 6 principles, and I think we'll do a bit deeper dive into those over the coming weeks.
For sure.
I think the takeaway for the week for me is probably, even though these are now 9 years old, we're actually already seeing the new iterations of these with the high impact teaching strategies. And I'm sure the 6 principles were an iteration of something that had come before that. And it's just this thing that keeps coming around as some quality teaching that keeps getting the results.
Exactly. Nothing beats good teaching.
That's right. All right, Matt. Well, we'll leave it here, and we will start planning our next episode, which will get out probably in a week's time.
Awesome. Look forward to it.
Thank you very much.
Have a good week, everyone.
Bye.